Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Chapter 4. An Evening in Uncle Tom's Cabin. The cabin of Uncle Tom was a small log building close adjoining to the house, as the Negro par excellence designates his master's dwelling. In front it had a neat garden patch where, every summer, strawberries, raspberries, and a variety of fruits and vegetables flourished under careful tending. The whole front of it was covered by a large scarlet begonia and a native multiflower rose, which, in twisting and interlacing, left scarce a vestige of the rough logs to be seen. Here, also in summer, various brilliant annuals such as marigolds, petunias, 4 o'clocks, found an indulgent corner in which to unfold their splendors, and where the delight and pride of Aunt Chloe's heart. Let us enter the dwelling. The evening meal at the house is over, and Aunt Chloe, who presided over its preparations as head cook, has left to inferior offices in the kitchen the business of clearing away and washing dishes, and came out into her own snug territories to get her old man's supper. Therefore, doubt not that it is her you see by the fire, presiding with anxious interest over certain frizzling items in the stewpan, and Annan with grave consideration lifting the cover of a bake kettle from whence steamed forth indubitably imitations of something good. A round, black, shiny face is hers, so glossy as to suggest the idea that she might have been washed over with white of eggs, like one of her own tea rusks. Her whole plump countenance beams with satisfaction and contentment from under her well-starched checked turban, bearing on it, however, if we must confess it, a little of that tinge of self-consciousness which becomes the first cook of the neighborhood, as Aunt Chloe was universally held and acknowledged to be. A cook she certainly was, in the very bone and center of her soul. Not a chicken or turkey or duck in the barnyard but looked grave when they saw her approaching, and seemed evidently to be reflecting on their latter end, and certain it was that she was always meditating on trussing, stuffing, and roasting to a degree that was calculated to inspire terror in any reflecting fowl living. Her corn cake and all its varieties of hoe cake, dodgers, muffins, and other species too numerous to mention, was a sublime mystery to all less practised compounders, and she would shake her fat sides with honest pride and merriment as she would narrate the fruitless efforts that one and another of her compeers had made to attain to her elevation. The arrival of company at the house, the arranging of dinners and suppers in style, awoke all the energies of her soul, and no sight was more welcome to her than a pile of traveling trunks launched on the veranda, for then she foresaw fresh efforts and fresh triumphs. Just at present, however, Aunt Chloe is looking into the bake pan, in which congenial operation we shall leave her till we finish our picture of the cottage. In one corner of it stood a bed, covered neatly with a snowy spread, and by the side of it was a piece of carpeting, and of some considerable size. On this piece of carpeting Aunt Chloe took her stand, as being decidedly in the upper walls of life, and it and the bed by which it lay, and the whole corner, in fact, were treated with distinguished consideration, and made, so far as possible, sacred from the marauding inroads and the desecrations of little folks. In fact, that corner was the drawing-room of her establishment. In the other corner was a bed of much humbler pretensions, and evidently designed for use. The wall over the fireplace was adorned with some very brilliant scriptural prints and a portrait of General Washington, drawn and colored in a manner which would certainly have astonished that hero if ever he had happened to meet with its like. On a rough bench in the corner, a couple of woolly-headed boys with glistening black eyes and fat shiny cheeks were busy in superintending the first walking operations of the baby, which, as is usual the case, consisted in getting up on its feet, balancing a moment, and then tumbling down, each successive failure being violently cheered as something decidedly clever. A table, somewhat rheumatic in its limbs, with drawn out in front of the fire, and covered with a cloth displaying cups and saucers of a decidedly brilliant pattern, with other symptoms of an approaching meal. At this table was seated Uncle Tom, Mr. Shelby's best hand, who, as he is to be the hero of our story, he must daguerreotype for our readers. He was a large, broad-chested, powerfully made man of a full, glossy black, and a face whose truly African features were characterized by an expression of grave and steady good sense, united with much kindliness and benevolence. There was something about his whole air self-respecting and dignified, yet united with a confident and humble simplicity. He was very busily intent at that moment on a slate lying before him, on which he was carefully and slowly endeavoring to accomplish a copy of some letters, in which operation he was overlooked by young Master George, a smart, bright boy of 13, who appeared fully to realize the dignity of his position as instructor. "Not that way, Uncle Tom, not that way," he said briskly, as Uncle Tom laboriously brought up a tell of his G the wrong side out. "That makes a Q, you see." "La sakes, now, does it?" said Uncle Tom, looking with a respectful, admiring air as his young teacher flourishly scrawled Q's and G's, innumerable for his edification, and then, taking the pencil in his big heavy fingers, he patiently recommenced. "How easy white folks always does things," said Aunt Chloe, pausing while she was greasing a griddle with a scrap of bacon on her fork, and regarding young Master George with pride. "The way he can write now, and read too, and then to come out here evenings and read his lessons to us. It's mighty interesting." "But Aunt Chloe, I'm getting mighty hungry," said George. "Isn't that cake in the skillet almost done?" "Most done, Massa George," said Aunt Chloe, lifting the lid and peering in. "Brown and beautiful, a real lovely brown. Ah, let me alone for dat. Missus let Sally try to make some cake the other day, just to learn her, she said. 'Oh, go way, missus,' says I. 'It really hurts my feelin's now to see good vittles spilt dat-a-way. Cakes rise all to one side, no shape at all, no more than my shoe go away.'" And with this final expression of contempt for Sally's greenness, Aunt Chloe whipped the cover off of the bake kettle and disclosed to view a neatly baked pound cake, of which no city confectioner need to have been ashamed. This being evidently the center point of the entertainment, Aunt Chloe began now to bustle about earnestly in the supper department. "Here you, Mose and Pete, get out of the way, you niggers, get away. Polly, honey, Mama'll give you her baby somepin by and by. Now, Master George, you just take off them books and set down now with my old man, and I'll take up the sausages and have de first griddle cake of cakes on your plates in dest in no time." They wanted me to come to supper in the house, said George, but I knew what too well for that, Aunt Chloe. So you did, honey, said Aunt Chloe, heaping the smoking batter cakes on his plate. You knowed your auntie keep the best for you. Oh, let you alone for dat. Go away. And with that, Auntie gave George a nudge with her finger, designed to be immensely facetious, and turned again to her griddle with great briskness. Now for the cake, said Master George, when the activity of the griddle department had somewhat subsided, and with that the youngster flourished a large knife over the article in question. Law bless you, Master George, said Aunt Chloe, with earnestness, catching his arm. You wouldn't be for cutting it with that old great heavy knife, smash all down, spill it all de pretty rise of it. Here, I've got a thin old knife I keeps it sharp for purpose. Dar, now see, comes apart light as a feather. Now eat away. You won't get anything to beat there at. Tom Lincoln said George, speaking with his mouth full, that their Jenny is a better cook than you. Dem Lincolns ain't much count no way, said Aunt Chloe contemptuously. I mean, set aside your folks. They're 'spectable folks enough in the kinder plain way, but as to getting up something in style, they don't begin to have a notion on it. Set Master Lincoln now alongside Master Shelby. Good Lord. And Mrs. Lincoln, can she kinder sweep it into a room like my missus, so kinder splendid, you know? Oh, go away. Don't tell me nothing about them Lincolns. And Aunt Chloe tossed her head as one who hoped she didn't know something of the world. Well, though, I've heard you say, said George, that Jenny was a pretty fair cook. So I did, said Aunt Chloe. I may say dat. Good plain common cookin' Jenny'll do. Make a good pone of bread. Bile her taters far. Her corn cakes isn't extra. Not extra now. Jenny's corn cakes isn't, but then there's far. But Lor, come to de high branches, and what can she do? Why, she makes pies, startin' she does, but what kind of crust? Can she make your real flaky paste that melts in your mouth and lies all up like a puff? Now I went over thar when Miss Mary was going to be married, and Jenny, she just showed me de weddin' pies. Jenny and I's good friends, you know. I never said nothin', but go long, Master George. Why, I shouldn't sleep a wink for a week if I had a batch of pies like them, or why, dey wasn't no count at all. I suppose Jenny thought they were ever so nice, said George. Thought so, didn't she? Thar she was, showing 'em as innocent. You see, it's just here Jenny don't know. Lor, the family ain't nothin'. She can't be. 'Spectin' to know, 'tain't no fault of hern. Oh, Master George, she doesn't know half your privileges in your family and bringin' up. Here Aunt Chloe sighed and rolled her eyes with emotion. I'm sure, Aunt Chloe, I understand all my pie and puddin' privileges, said George. Ask Tom Lincoln if I don't crow over him every time I meet him. Aunt Chloe sat back in her chair and indulged in the hearty guff of laughter at this witticism of young Master's, laughing till the tears rolled down her black shiny cheeks, and varying the exercise with playful slapping and poking Master Georgie, and telling him to go away, and that he was a case, and that he was fit to kill her, and that he sartin would kill her one of these days, and between each of these sanguinary predictions going off into a laugh, each longer and stronger than the other, till George really began to think that he was a very dangerously witty fellow, and that it became him to be careful how he talked as funny as he could. And so ye telled Tom, did ye? Oh, Lord, what young'uns will be up to! You're crowded over, Tom. Oh, Lord, Master George, if you wouldn't be a hornbug laugh. Yes, said George. I says to him, Tom, you ought to see some of Aunt Chloe's pies. They're the right sort, I say. Says I. Pity now Tom couldn't, said Aunt Chloe on those benevolent heart. The idea of Tom's benighted condition seemed to make a strong impression. You oughter just ask him here to dinner some of these times, Master George, she added. It would look quite pretty of you, Master George. You out in there feel above everybody, nobody, and count your privileges, 'cause all our privileges, and to us, we ought always to remember that, said Aunt Chloe, looking quite serious. Well, I mean to ask Tom here some day, next week, said George, and you do your prettiest, Aunt Chloe, and we'll make him stare. Won't we make him eat so he won't get over it for a fortnight? Yes, yes, Sartin, said Aunt Chloe, delighted. You'll see. Lord, to think of some of our dinners. You're mind Dadda's great chicken pie I made when we guv to dinner to General Knox. I and the missus, we come pretty near quarrelling about that there crust. What does gettin' to ladies sometimes, I don't know, but sometimes when a body has the heaviest kind of responsibility on 'em, as ye may say, and is all kinder serious and taken up, they takes that our time to be hangin' around and kinda interferin'. Now, missus, she wants me to do it this way, and she wanted me to do it that way, and finally I got kind of saucy, and I said, now, missus, do just look at them beautiful white hands of yourn with long fingers, and all the speckling with rings, like my white lilies upon dewdrops on 'em. And look at my great black stumpin' hands. Now, don't y'all think that the Lord must have meant me to make the pie crust, and you stay in the parlor? Dar I just so saucy, Master George. And what did mother say? Said George. Say? Why, she kind of laughed at her eyes, them great handsome eyes of hern, and she says, well, Aunt Chloe, I think you are about in the right on it, she says, and went off in the parlor. She cracked me over the head for being so saucy, but dar's what it is. I can't do nothin' with them ladies in the kitchen. Well, you made out well with that dinner. I remember everybody said so, said George. Didn't I? And wasn't I behind the dining room door day, very day, and I decided the general pass his plate 3 times for some more of dat berry pie, and says he, you must have an uncommon cook, Mrs. Shelby. Lor, I can fit to split myself. And the general, he knows what cooking is, said Aunt Chloe, drawing himself up in an air. Very nice man, the general. He comes on one of them very fussiest families in old Virginia. He knows what's what now, as well as I do, the general. You see, there's pints in all pies, Master George, but 'tain't everybody knows what they is, or ought to be. But the general, he knows. I knew by his marks he made. Yes, he knows what de pints is. By this time Master George had arrived at that pass to which even a boy can come, under uncommon circumstances, when he really could not eat another morsel, and therefore he was at leisure to notice the pile of woolly heads and glistening eyes which were regarding their operations hungrily from the opposite corner. Here, you Mose, Pete, he said, breaking off liberal bites and throwing it at him. You want some, don't you? Come, Aunt Chloe, bake them some cakes. And George and Tom moved to the comfortable seat in the chimney corner, while Aunt Chloe, after baking a goodly pile of cakes, took her baby on her lap and began alternately filling its mouth and her own, and distributing to Moss and Pete, who seemed rather to prefer eating theirs as they rolled about on the floor under the table, tickling each other, and occasionally pulling the baby's toes. Oh, go 'long, will ya? Said the mother, giving now and then a kick in a kind of gentler way, under the table, and then the movement became too obstreperous. "Can't ye be decent when white folks comes to see ye? Stop that, or now, will ye? Better mind yourselves, or I'll take ye down a buttonhole lower than Master George is gone." What meaning was crouched under the terrible threat, it was difficult to say, but certain it is that its awful indistinctness seemed to produce very little impression on the young sinners addressed. "Law now," said Uncle Tom, "they are so full of tickle all the while they can't behave themselves." Here the boys emerged from under the table, and with hands and faces well plastered with molasses, began a vigorous kissing on the baby. "Get along, would ya?" said the mother, pushing away their woolly heads. "Y'all all stuck together, and never get clear. What if you do dat fashion? Go 'long to de spring and wash yourself," she said. Secondly, her extortion is by a slap, which resounded much formidably, but which seemed only to knock out so much more laughter from the young ones, as they tumbled precipitately over each other out the doors, where they fairly screamed with merriment. "Did you ever see such aggravatin' young'uns?" said Aunt Chloe, rather complacently, as, producing an old towel kept for such emergencies, she poured a little water out of the cracked teapot on it, and began rubbing off the molasses from the baby's face and hands, and having polished her till she shone, she set her down in Tom's lap, while she busied herself in clearing away supper. The baby employed the intervals in pulling Tom's nose, scratching his face, burying her fat hands in his woolly hair, which last operation seemed to afford her special content. "Ain't she a pearl, young'un?" said Tom, holding her from him to take a full-length view. Then, getting up, he set her on his broad shoulders and began capering and dancing around her, while Master George snapped at her with his pocket handkerchief, and Moss and Pete now returned again, roaring after her like bears, till Aunt Chloe decided that they fairly took her head off with all that noise. According to her own statement, this surgical operation was a matter of daily occurrence in the cabin. The declaration no whit abated the merriment, till everyone had roared and tumbled and danced themselves down to a state of composure. "Well, now, I hope yours done," said Aunt Chloe, who had been busy in pulling out a rude box of the trundle bed. "And now you Mose and you Pete get into there, for we're going to have a meetin'." "Oh, Mother, we don't want her. We want to sit up to meetin'. Meetin' is so curious. We likes 'em." "Law, Aunt Chloe, shove it under and let 'em sit up," said Mr. George, decisively giving a push to the rude machine. Aunt Chloe, having thus saved appearances, seemed highly delighted to push the thing under, saying, as she did so, "Well, maybe 'twill do 'em some good." The House now resolved itself into a committee of the whole, to consider the accommodations and arrangements for the meeting. "What's we's to do for cheers now? I declare I don't know," said Aunt Chloe. As the meeting had been held at Uncle Tom's weekly for an indefinite length of time, without any more cheers, there seemed some encouragement to hope that a way would be discovered at present. "Old Uncle Peter sung both de legs out dat oldest cheer last week," suggested Mose. "You go long. I'll bound you pull 'em out some of your shines," said Aunt Chloe. "Well, it'll stand if it only keeps jam up again de wall," said Mose. "Den Uncle Peter mustn't sit in it, 'cause he'll always hitches when he gets a singin'. He hitched pretty nigh across your room de other night," said Pete. "Good Lord, get him in it then," said Mose, and then he'd begin. "Come saints and sinners, hear me tell," and then down he'd go, and Mose imitated precisely the nasal tones of the old man, tumbling on the floor to illustrate the supposed catastrophe. "Come now, be decent, can't you?" said Aunt Chloe. "Ain't you ashamed?" Master George, however, joined the offender in a laugh, and declared decidedly that Mose was a buster, so the maternal admonition seemed rather to fail of effect. Well, old man, said Aunt Chloe, you'll have to tote in them barses. Mother's bars is like are wider. Master George was reading about in the good book. They never fell, said Moses, aside to Pete. I'm sure one of 'em caved in last week, said Pete, and let 'em all down in the middle and just singing. That are about falling, weren't it? During this aside between Mose and Pete, two empty casks had been rolled into the cabin and being secured from rolling by stones on each side. Boards were laid across them, which arrangement, together with the turning down of certain tubs and pails, and the disposing of the rickety chairs, at last completed the preparation. Master George is such a beautiful reader. Now I know he'll stay to read for us, said Aunt Chloe. 'Pears like 'twill be such more interesting. George readily consented, for your boy is always ready for anything that makes him of importance. The room was soon filled with a motley assemblage, from the old gray-haired patriarch of 80 to the young girl and a lad of 15. A little harmless gossip ensued where various themes, such as where old Aunt Sally got her new handkerchief, and how Missus was going to give Lily that spotted muslin gown when she got her new barrage made up, and how Master Shelby was thinking of buying a new sorrel coat that was going to prove an addition to the glories of the place. A few of the worshippers belonged to the families hard by, who had got permission to attend, and who brought in various choice scraps of information about the sayings and doings at the house and on the place, which circulated as freely as the same sort of small change does in higher circles. After a while the singing commenced, to all evidence delight of all present. Not even all the disadvantage of nasal incantation could prevent the effect of the naturally fine voices. In airs at once wild and spirited, the words were sometimes the well-known and common hymns sung in the churches about, and sometimes of the wilder, more indefinite character picked up at camp meetings. The chorus of one of them, which ran as follows, was sung with great energy and unction. On the field of battle, die on the field of battle, glory in my soul. Another special favorite had oft repeated the words, oh, I'm going to glory, won't you come along with me? Don't you see the angels beckoning and calling me away? Don't you see the golden city and the everlasting day? There were others which made incessant mention of Jordan's banks and Canaan's fields and New Jerusalem, for the Negro mind, impassioned and imaginative, always attaches itself to hymns and expressions of a vivid, pictorial nature, and as they sang, some laughed and some cried, and some clapped their hands or shook hands rejoicing with each other as if they had fairly gained the other side of the river. Various extortions or relations of experience followed and intermingled with the singing. One old great-headed woman, long past work, but much revered as a sort of chronicle in the past, rose and, leaning on her staff, said, well, children, well, I'm mighty glad to hear y'all and see y'all once more, 'cause I don't know when I'll be gone to glory, but I've done got ready, children. 'Pears like I got my little bundle all tied up and my bonnet on, just a-waitin' for the stage to come along and take me home. Sometimes in the night I think I hear the wheels a-rattlin', and I'm looking out all the time now. You just be ready, too, for I tell you all, children, she said, striking her staff hard on the door, that glory is a mighty thing. It's a mighty thing, children. You don't know nothing about it. It's wonderful. And the old creature sat down with streaming tears as wholly overcome, while the whole circle struck up. O Canaan, bright Canaan, I'm bound for the Canaan land. Master George, by request, read the last chapters of Revelation, often interrupted by such exclamations as, "The sakes now! Only hear that! Just think on it! Is all that a comin' sure enough?" George, who was a bright boy and well trained in religious things by his mother, finding himself an object of general admiration, threw in expositions of his own from time to time, with a commendable seriousness and gravity, for which he was admired by the young and blessed by the old, and it was agreed on all hands that a minister couldn't lay it off better than he did. That was 'twas really amazing. Uncle Tom was a sort of patriarch in religious matters in the neighborhood, having naturally an organization in which the moral was strongly predominant, together with a great breadth and cultivation of the mind that among his companions he was looked up at with great respect as a sort of minister among them, and the simple, hearty, sincere style of his exhortations might have edified even better educated persons, but it was in prayer that he was especially excelled. Nothing could exceed the touching simplicity, the childlike earnestness of his prayers, enriched with the language of Scripture, which seemed so entirely to have wrought itself into his being, as to have become a part of him, and to drop from his lips unconsciously. In the language a pious old Negro, he prayed right up. And so much did his prayer always work on the devotional feelings of his audiences that there seemed often a danger that it would be lost altogether in the abundance of the responses which broke out everywhere around him. While this scene was passing in the cabin of men, one quiet otherwise passed in the halls of the master. The trader and Mr. Shelby were seated together in the dining room aforenamed, at a table covered with papers and writing utensils. Mr. Shelby was busy in counting some bundles of bills, while, as they were counted, he pushed over to the trader, who counted them likewise. "All fair," said the trader, "and now for signing these." Here, Mr. Shelby hastily drew the bills of sale toward him and signed them like a man that hurries over some disagreeable business, and then pushed them over with the money. Haley produced from a well-worn valise a parchment which, after looking over it for a moment, he handed to Mr. Shelby, who took it with the gesture of suppressed eagerness. "Well, now, the thing's done," said the trader, getting up. "It's done," said Mr. Shelby, in a musing note, and fetching a long breath, he repeated, "It's done." "You don't seem to feel much pleased with it, 'pears me," said the trader. "Haley," said Mr. Shelby, "I hope you'll remember that you promised on your honor you wouldn't sell Tom without knowing what sort of hands he's going into." "Why, you've just done it, sir," said the trader. "Circumstances, you well know, obliged me," said Shelby haughtily. "Well, you know, they may oblige me too," said the trader. "Howsomever, I'll do the very best I can at getting Tom a good berth. As to my treating on him bad, you needn't be a grain afeard. If there's anything that I thank the Lord for, it is that I'm never no ways cruel." After the expositions of which the trader had previously given of his humane principles, Mr. Shelby did not feel particularly reassured by these declarations, but, as they were the best comfort the case admitted of, he allowed the trader to depart in silence, and took himself to a solitary cigar.